good evening or good morning, whichever the case may be. I'm really delighted to welcome you to the fourth of our October-December 2021 workshop series, a discussion of data relationalities with special guest Salomé Viljoen joining us from Columbia University and guest facilitator Michelle Gilman joining us from Baltimore. Those of you returning from our recent meetings on stochastic parrots, data journalism, and big data know that our Ethics of Data Curation workshop is a joint effort between Rutgers Critical AI Initiative and our partners in a new international collaboration with the Australian National University. If you have missed some of these events, the video recordings are eventually archived on the Critical AI web platform, and we're going to put a link into the chat box for where you can find the blog and videos for both stochastic parrots and data journalism. The one on big data, and it was a really lively one, will be up in just a few days. Please note that we welcome asynchronous comments on the blogs and would be happy to respond to questions as well. If you're joining us for the first time, I especially welcome you. I'm Lauren Goodlad, by the way, a professor of English and Comparative Literature and the chair of the Critical AI Initiative at Rutgers. Our workshop this year is sponsored by grants from Rutgers Global, as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities. But we are also indebted to Critical AI's founding partners, the Center for Critical Analysis, directed by Colin Jager, and the Center for Cognitive Science, directed by John McGann. I want to take this opportunity also to thank Ellen Goodman, Associate Dean of Strategic Initiatives and Special Projects and Professor of Law at Rutgers, for her help in publicizing tonight's event. As always, I owe a special shout out to our incredibly talented and multitasking project assistant, Lucina Schwartz, to Caleb DeLorme, who has recently joined us as assistant to the project assistant, to our two hardworking undergrad assistants, as well as CCA's Dana Omarova, who helps us with technical support and a lot of other things. Finally, I thank my ANU co-organizers, Catherine Bode and Baden Palethorpe. I'm just going to take this occasion to mention the next workshop meeting on the topic of data justice. It's an interview and open discussion with Sasha Constanza-Chalk, Director of Research and Design at the Algorithmic Justice League, and we will have multiple interviewers for that event. If you haven't yet signed up for it, Lucina is going to put a registration link into the chat box. You'll also be able to find readings on our website. Meeting 6, that one, by the way, is taking place on December 2nd and December 3rd if you are in Australia. Meeting 6 taking place on Thursday, December 16 in the US and December 17 in Australia is Image Data Sets, a special event on AI and the arts with Katrina Sluice and Nicholas Malave. Please check out these events. Tonight, it's my special pleasure to introduce our guest facilitator. Michelle Gilman is a member of Critical AI's International Advisory Board and was an important contributor to our inaugural series earlier this year. So it's an honor as well as a delight to welcome her back. Before I introduce her, a quick reminder about logistics for tonight. We are currently in a webinar for the duration of Professor Viljoen's talk, after which Michelle Gilman will break the ice with a question or two. Then we'll take a very short break and reconvene in a regular Zoom forum for open discussion. And really being open, we love to hear from you in that second meeting. So please save your questions for the discussion. And if you haven't yet signed up for it, that too is now going into the chat box. Michelle Gilman is the Venerable Professor of Law at the University of Baltimore School of Law and Director of the Saul Ewing Civil Advocacy Clinic, in which capacities she works closely with low-income people in Maryland. In addition, Michelle serves as a co-director of the Center on Applied Feminism. Her recent scholarship focuses on the intersection of data privacy and poverty, with articles published in the California Law Review, Vanderbilt Law Review, and Washington University Law Review, among others, as well as in the popular media, including Huffington Post, Salon, and The Conversation. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Lauren. Well, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Salomé Viljoen, who will be giving some remarks tonight. She is an academic fellow at Columbia Law School and a former fellow and current affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. She studies how information law structures inequality in the information economy and how alternative legal arrangements may address that inequality, as we will hear tonight. Her current work focuses on the political economy of social data. Here, she's interested in how and whether changes in the information economy create new kinds of legal claims regarding social data's production and use, particularly where such legal claims give force to social and political demands to equality. So I was asked to give a few words before Salomé begins on the impact of her work from a grassroots legal services perspective, which is what I have. As Lauren explained, I direct a law clinic and I'm supervising students representing low-income Marylanders. And so I think it's important for us all to understand we're all caught up in surveillance capitalism, right? Our personal data is gathered, aggregated, analyzed all hours of the day or night in order to not only predict our behavior, but to shape it. But the harms of these networks are worse for low-income people, minorities, and other marginalized groups. And in fact, that's probably the reason why we have so few legal protections in this sphere, because our most politically disenfranchised people are the people most adversely impacted. So in my work with clients, I sort of see three patterns emerging. First, they are relentlessly targeted because they have digital profiles that mark them as vulnerable. Think about payday loan ads. You probably don't see them when you're searching around on Google, but my clients do. There are data brokers whose entire business model is to sell digital profiles of economically vulnerable people to predatory companies. Okay. Second, marginalized people are excluded by automated decision-making systems that act as gatekeepers to life necessities, housing, employment, education, healthcare. So landlords use tenant screening reports to pick tenants. Employers use applicant tracking systems to identify worthy job candidates. Colleges use digital profiles to identify students most likely to pay full freight, and then they go out and recruit those students and leave disadvantaged students behind. Right? And the third dynamic at play here is that marginalized people are heavily surveilled in their neighborhoods, in their workplaces and schools in ways that middle class and affluent people simply are not. And surveillance is always about social control. Okay. And so the legal remedies to protect people's privacy in the midst of these dynamics are few. Okay. As a constitutional matter, the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect against government use of data that people make public. And so much about us is out there in the public sphere, whether we know it or not. On the private side, the governing legal regime is called notice and consent. So when you access a website or an app for the first time, you get a little notice that pops up and a box to check. You probably don't read the legal gobbledygook that pops up, but when you check that box, you have given away free access to your data pretty much for any purpose and for all time. And so our legal regime is highly individualized. It puts the onus on each of us to police our own privacy. But that is impossible, given the highly networked systems that are buying and selling and trading our data, even as we speak right now together for Salomé's talk. And so here's where Salomé's work is so important. Okay, she is challenging the dominance of this individualistic framework of how we understand data flows and how we attempt to remedy them. Okay, so as a lawyer, I like rights and remedies. I want to get my clients, inaccurate data corrected and improve their credit report. I want to challenge a government algorithm that has reduced my client's Medicaid benefits and potentially harmed her health. But solving my client's individual problems leaves the structural inequities intact. The data continues to flow. The algorithms continue to churn. The digital profiles continue to serve as, gatekeepers to basic human rights and human needs. The power relations between the data subjects and the data profiteers remain in place. Individual notions of data harms are not enough to disrupt inequity. So Salomé, as she will describe in much greater detail, pushes us to understand the relational nature of data, how data is part of power relations between the data exploited and the data capitalists. And by reconceptualizing how data works as a social process, my hope is that we can come up with better laws and better policies to limit its harms and to shift power to the people who are impacted by algorithmic systems. So when I read her work, I see it as a really essential step to achieving data justice. And when I talk about data justice, I mean envisioning data-centric technologies that empower people rather than exploit or oppress them. So I'm so excited for her to share her work with us so you can learn about this in more detail. And I am confident that the discussion will be lively and engaging because what she's really offering is an entirely new vocabulary for understanding how data is used. And so with that, I will turn it over to Salomé.
Wow, thank you so much, Michelle, for that incredible introduction. I actually started in law school. I really thought I was going to go become a consumer protection lawyer doing predatory lending work. So that's really actually how I found myself in this area. So your remarks really resonated with how I sort of how I came to a lot of these topics, sort of primarily and foundationally interested in economic justice and issues of total economic disenfranchisement of clients. So yeah, that was really great. So I'm gonna quickly do a screen share. Hopefully. So can you all just see my slide right now, my little intro slide?
Yeah, looks perfect.
All right, great. Yeah, so the talk I'm presenting today mostly will be sort of drawing on a paper that's forthcoming from the Yale Law Journal, but it's really touches on a lot of my more general interests in social claims to social data, by which I mean data about people. And as you'll see in the talk, I'm very deliberate about using the term social data and not personal data. And I'm really interested, as Michelle sort of highlighted, in how different legal regimes articulate claims to social data. And about social data and how these legal claims can end up facilitating inequality. And also how our ability to kind of theorize and give legal force to different claims to social data actually play a really central role in legal agendas to address inequality, not just in the information economy, but in our political economy more broadly. So you all have been sort of working in various sort of critical traditions around technology for a while. So my argument might strike people in this room as really a simple one, which is that the point behind a great deal of data collection in the digital economy is to relate people to one another. So to place people in categories or groups that are relevant in that they bear on that individual's likely future behavior on the basis of group membership. So these population features that people share are not just features they have in common, but they're socially and economically relevant features that they have in common. In other words, how people are alike in terms of location, age, political preference, physical appearance, shopping habits, education level, etc., has some bearing on their likelihood to exhibit certain behavioral features. So in other words, our social relations to others are also predictive statements about us. And again, I think that that's sort of simultaneously very obvious, but very not obvious and very powerful. It's this predictive capacity of our social relations that make that computational project of grouping and predicting behavioral patterns so lucrative for the various companies in the data economy. And again, this is maybe a simple point, but this relational purpose behind data collection also gives rise to some of the most pressing forms of social harm that kind of plague us in an era of mass data extraction and data exploitation. So the way I kind of think about this is that in an increasingly digital world, datafication, by which I mean placing people into data relations, datafication is one material process whereby a great deal of social injustice happens. So these data relations are a digital expression of the growing gap between tech's winners and losers, those who predominantly benefit from datafication's personalization and efficiency, and those who disproportionately bear its risks. So sometimes these gaps are economic and distributive, like those between platform CEOs and the hyper-surveilled gig workers who make them rich. But it's not always economic. So sometimes these data relations are primarily social and they don't express as economic inequality, like those between Amazon Ring homeowners who enjoy being able to make sure their packages are safe and have arrived on time, and passersby, maybe particularly poor or non-white passersby, but the Ring subjects to heightened risk of violent police encounters. So in both of those cases, data relations are materializing relationships of domination between different groups of people. On this relational account, the harm of datafication is not only personal, but social. So data flows trace relations whereby we might exploit one another, and whereby many of us may unwittingly become drafted into the project of one another's oppression. So in other words, this relational feature and function of data production is how data collection and use amplifies or enacts forms of social inequality. And for me as a legal scholar, I kind of step back and say, as a result of all of this, both like the foundational role of relations in producing economic incentives to collect data and their sort of central role in producing a lot of the social concerns we care about, this relational kind of feature of data production matters a great deal for the law, for data governance law. Yet, as I'll explore in greater detail, it's largely absent from the status quo and even in some of the most prominent proposals of reform. And I think this really leaves the law out of step with a core form of economic activity that it purports to regulate. And it leaves important forms of injustice arising from this activity totally unindexed in our law. As a scholar, I also think it surfaces some really interesting conceptual and normative puzzles about what the central task of data governance law in an increasingly digital economy ought to be, what harms it should protect us against, what forms of harm it ought to bring under its purview. So to start all of this off, as we've been speaking very abstractly, let's consider a very concrete hypothetical scenario. So Adam here is a tattoo enthusiast and a former gang member who uploads photos of his tattoos to Tattoo View AI, just a social media site for tattoo enthusiasts. And Tattoo View aggregates and synthesizes their tattoo image data that users have shared to sell insights and ad placements to advertisers and other clients who are interested in this kind of community of tattoo enthusiasts. And that includes employment agencies who screen candidates for jobs, credit agencies and health insurers who are interested in the risk-taking behavior of this community. And all of this kind of activity makes Tattoo View a lot of money. They've also recently agreed to allow law enforcement to access their tattoo database and use Tattoo View's systems to help them predict which tattoos are signs of likely gang membership. So these predictive systems help law enforcement identify that the tattoo image that Adam uploaded is a likely sign of gang membership, which, down the line cause police to then detain Adam. So to recap, we have a data subject here, Adam, who has his data collected by a data collector, Tattoo View, who uses the insights derived from this data to make predictions about Adam that they or their data sharing partners then act on. So this scenario presents a series of legal questions, and there are kind of two predominant schools of thought in response to this data flow: what makes it wrong and what should be done about it. So the first kind of cluster or school of approaches can be characterized as propertarian in their view of data governance. So propertarians would argue that it's unjust that TattooView is getting rich from this valuable resource that they're getting from Adam for free, and then using it in various ways that violate his interests. So they argue that this is kind of like Adam's working for free, and it's like a form of feudalism. It represents a legal arrangement of unjust enrichment. And so here the kind of intuition is this is Adam's data and he deserves to be paid for it. So in response to sort of try to level that playing field between TattooView and Adam, they advocate for a property or a labor right to Adam to his data, such that he can command a price in a market, either a labor market or kind of a property market for the data. And in doing so, kind of exert a greater degree of control over who gets to collect this data and at what price. So this really proposes acting on collection, giving Adam more rights against TattooView, again, to sort of try and even that playing field. The other sort of predominant cluster or school of approaches can be characterized as a dignitarian view of data governance. So dignitarians would respond that payment at the point of collection just isn't enough. This does nothing to prevent downstream uses of Adam's data that might violate his interests, like the police detaining him on the basis of his tattoo, or him being passed over for a job opportunity because of his gang-affiliated tattoo. Nor does payment necessarily prevent TattooView from wanting to extract ever more data from Adam in order to make their valuable but invasive interventions into his behavior. Therefore, dignitarians would argue that payment ignores what they really view as the original sin of data extraction, the unjust violation of Adam's inner sphere in ways that circumvent his will, that render him legible to TattooView's systems for purposes that undermine his capacity to enact his own free will in the world. So to dignitarians, this excessive data extraction represents something of a deontological violation. It's the unjust commodification of Adam's inner life, rendering him legible for TattooView's profit and for purposes that, when they act back on Adam to change or affect his behavior, violate his dignity by restricting or undermining his capacity to act as an autonomous being. So in response, dignitarians tend to advocate for a more robust suite of interventions aimed at really reinforcing Adam's ability to express his will at the point of collection and to protect TattooView's attempts to undermine his autonomy in the way it uses Adam's data to influence him or change his behavior. So these legal responses often take the form of granting Adam inalienable, even fundamental rights to his data that don't extinguish at the point of collection, but give him rights against certain downstream uses so that core rights of his aren't violated in how his data is used. Dignitarians also tend to advocate or impose higher thresholds for what counts as consent to ensure that Adam is providing really robust, meaningful consent at the point of collection. So as you'll see from my little arrows here, dignitarian responses really propose acting on both collection and use to sort of even that playing field between Adam and TattooView AI. So if we go back to our original scenario, both of these different theories currently occurring in data governance law have real benefits to offer Adam and may meaningfully reduce the coercive power that TattooView is able to exert over Adam. So if we give Adam a right to payment, either for his wage data or his property data, it would maybe be too expensive for companies like TattooView to collect all this data, or Adam simply wouldn't agree to sell at a price that they're offering. Conversely, if he did agree to sell his data, we might think he's getting a fair price that he kind of bargained in the market for. And he's at least in this scenario, we're redistributing some of that value of data production back to the data laborer, the data producer, which is Adam. So we're getting a little bit of redistribution here. If we grant an inalienable right, Adam might enjoy certain robust rights, like even constitutional rights, not to have his personal information used against him. So we might sort of extend warrant protections to the police getting his tattoo data, or sort of impose a standard of probable cause for them to use any sort of information about Adam against him. So, both interventions are again, they're aimed at evening that playing field between Adam and TattooView and sort of distributing coercive power among these two actors more fairly. But there's kind of a problem with this neat little story that I have been painting here, which is that none of this is really capturing the full story about how data production in the contemporary digital economy actually works, and how it's meaningfully different from how data may have been used to create value prior to its use in mass at-scale computation. So both of these two theories really advance approaches that are strengthening individualistic data subject rights. But individual data subject rights cannot account for a central feature of why data collection is so valuable in the current digital economy, which is not for what data reveals about that one data subject, that atom, but for how data can be used to build predictive systems based on shared characteristics that relate data subjects to others. And I really argue that to properly understand the full set of challenges posed by data production, both those to individual autonomy and those of group equality, we need to pay attention to how data production is deeply, even fundamentally relational. And taking this feature seriously requires that we place it at the center, not at the margins, of how data governance law is evaluated and enacted. So again, to make this a bit more concrete, here's an updated scenario for you. So we have Adam, our tattoo enthusiast and former gang member, who uploads photos of his tattoos to Tattoo View, who, as we discussed, partners with law enforcement to help them predict tattoos that indicate signs of gang membership, including Adam's tattoo. They then use this information not to detain Adam, but to detain Ben, who has the same tattoo as Adam. And on the basis of the shared tattoo, the police sort of question Ben for suspected gang membership. Now we can understand the relationships behind this data flow a few ways. So the vertical axis here is really meant to capture the way that this data flow relates Adam and Tattoo View. So the vertical relation is governed via Adam's contractual terms of service, the notice and consent regime that Michelle was talking about, as well as all of the background privacy rules that kind of set how his information can be collected, that determine kind of that distribution of rights, duties, and privileges among Adam and Tattoo View. And that's really the terrain on which data governance debates about proprietarian and dignitarian protections are happening. But what I really want to focus on is that there's also this horizontal relation, that Adam's act of uploading his tattoo image puts him in a relationship via this data flow with Ben. In a sense, data about Adam's tattoo is also data about Ben's tattoo. And this data might be used to make predictions or guide behavior in ways that impact Ben just as much as it might impact Adam. To make things a bit more fleshed out and maybe complex, these horizontal relations are actually population level relations. So Adam is in a horizontal relation, not just with Ben, but potentially everyone in population 2, or all the Bens that share this tattoo with Adam. And the same is true the other way around. So it's not just Ben, but everyone in population 2, all the Bens may have an interest in what Adam, or all the Adams in population 1 share that discloses actionable information about them. So these horizontal ties give rise to population level interests. Insofar as either Adam or Ben have an interest in how tattoo image data is used, that interest accrues at that population level, by which I mean it attaches or is implicated by the choices of anyone who shares this population feature. So really, the data production economy may be said to look something like this highly simplified kind of graph. You have a population of data subjects from whom data is being collected, which is then used to synthesize and build behavioral models to make predictions or attempt to influence the behavior, not just of people in that one population, but also people in population 2 that share relevant features with that population and potentially future populations. And this sort of relational function of data production is the point of data collection in the digital economy. And here, I really depart from a lot of the conversations about externalities to say that relating people to one another is not like exhaust or pollution that just kind of happens to arise as these companies collect fine-grained information about Adam that they stick in the Adam folder. Like, no, it's not kind of this accidental off-gassing. It's central. It's the point. Relating people to one another is how money is made in online search and advertising. So I am a member of a population set with a set series of actionable features. I'm a woman, I'm a millennial, I have a cat, and I recently bought him a nice mid-century ceramic cat bowl. So these features about me are used to make inferences about others that sort of share those population characteristics. So another millennial woman who has a cat might also be likely to buy her cat an expensive mid-century cat bowl. And again, the same is true the other way around. So some other cat owner out there may have bought a GPS tracking collar for their cat. I also have a cat. I might also buy that expensive GPS tracker for my cat. And this kind of relational activity can be good for other people. So because because Ben shares relevant features with Adam, who's a very responsible lendee, Ben might get a lower interest rate than he otherwise would. So in this case, Adam being responsible and sharing responsible behaviors with Ben results in Ben getting a lower interest rate. But again, the same is true the other way around. If Adam is an irresponsible lendee and he shares relevant features with Ben, Ben might get a higher interest rate than he otherwise would. Either way, given how the digital economy works, the Bens have an interest at stake in the Adam's observed behavior. So really, for me as a legal scholar, the core problem here is that this sort of core feature that data is literally collected and monetized in such a way that it reflects how people relate to one another is really absent in our law governing these data flows. So this is true both of the status quo and of those sort of proprietarian and dignitarian proposals for how to reform the status quo. And I think this really matters for data governance law. So if we apply an individual rights approach to population level interests and population level problems that do not reduce to that individual level, certain failures arise as a result. So first, salient forms of social informational harm go unaddressed by our data governance law. That is not only the individual risk of harm that Adam faces with respect to data about Adam, but also all of the stakes and interests that accrue along horizontal relations as a result of Adam's data being extracted. So here we can consider the interest that Ben has in Adam not sharing his tattoo data with TattooView. Second, and kind of a related point here, is that socially beneficial forms of data production might be foreclosed. So again, assigning a very strong individual right to Adam to prevent data collection might foreclose or dampen certain vital forms of data production that benefit others who aren't Adam. So here we could consider, for example, that Ben is a citizen of the global South, may have in Adam a citizen of the global North's carbon emissions data for articulating demands of climate reparations. So we might think reducing that full opt-out right to Adam alone will lead to the underproduction of climate emissions data and limit that population of Ben's demands on the basis of that data. So in short, not adequately representing all the interests at stake in data governance may result in the overproducing of socially harmful data and the underproducing of socially beneficial data. A third really important issue that sort of refracts through both of those first two is that the stakes of this non-representation of those interests, those horizontal relations, are not evenly distributed. So of course, some people face far greater costs than others from not having their interests represented in data governance. And again, the flip side, others face far greater foregone benefits when their interests are not represented. So assigning individual data subject rights really says nothing about these population level incentives and effects. And if these solutions can't represent those relational effects, it can't hope to address and adjudicate among them. So these relational interests, I argue, really represent quintessentially collective governance problems. How to adjudicate between competing population level interests that arise from data flows. How to recognize the mutual obligations of those in horizontal relation to one another, and how to distribute the benefits and risks of data production fairly among the interests at stake in any given process of data production. This really, to me, means that we have to reorient our conception of what the task of data governance is, from providing individuals rights of exit, payment, or recourse with respect to individual data, to securing people recognition and standing to shape the purposes and conditions of data production that affect them. This reorientation really clarifies what makes data production potentially wrongful, which is not simply a data subject is given consent or not, but whether a data flow materializes an unjust and potentially unlawful social relation of oppression or domination. Expanding the scope of interest we consider in data production can also, I think, give us helpful conceptual footing for positive forms of data production. So I was sort of hinting at this with the Adam Ben climate emissions data example. So just like our data relations can be relations of exploitation or oppression, which many of them currently are, like analog social relations, we can sort of reconfigure or reimagine our data relations to be relations of equality and even empowerment. Defining datafication in this way doesn't just present us, I think, with a more complete picture of how the process of data production actually works. It also, again, points a way towards making datafication more just. As I sort of hinted at, thinking about the analog to our social relations, our data relations could be empowering and supportive. They can act as moral magnifiers, enabling us to achieve goals together that we couldn't accomplish alone. So thinking of datafication as the digital terms by which we relate to one another, I think clarifies a proper aim of positive digitalization agendas and a proper aim of a legal theory of information that makes room for such positive agendas. So I might just sort of pause there on an uncharacteristically positive note and turn things over to Michelle, who I know has a few questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I love the slides for illustrating your points. They were fantastic. So I'm sure
Thanks.
one thing the audience is probably interested in, and I am, and you do talk about this a bit in your paper, but it's how do we operationalize what data governance in a democratic form would look like? I know you have some like nascent ideas around that, and I think it would be really exciting for the audience to hear kind of what you're thinking about. What does it look like for Adam and for Ben to be part of a data governance regime rather than a data exploitation regime?
Yeah. So, as Michelle and I spoke briefly earlier this week, and I sort of hinted at a few of my ideas about this. So, this piece is definitely theoretical, and as I mentioned to her, I think the first step is just saying in law, look, legally relevant interests exist here that we're not currently indexing in our law at all. So to even say that Ben might have an interest that we care about in the law of data governance is kind of the first step. Now, once we recognize that interest, there are all sorts of ways for us in the law to kind of give legal force to or operationalize those interests. So, they can take a variety of forms. So one version that we had discussed earlier this week is to say, okay, you can think of operationalizing these sorts of collective interests or horizontal interests as licensing regimes. So if let's say Uber wants to operate in the city of New York, which is where I live, we could imagine the city of New York saying, okay, you can operate here, but in order to operate here, you have to impose an API layer on your system that can be accessed by any of the drivers in the city of New York, and that all of the data flows that flow to Uber also flow into a repository that all of the collected group of drivers in the city of New York also have access to, and they can analyze that, and they can use that to sort of negotiate and bargain with Uber, what my friend Christina Colo refers to as negotiating the algorithm as like a labor justice thing. So that's one way of operationalizing the set of interests that drivers, sort of a third party group, might have in one another's information, and kind of pooling that as a way to sort of equalize power relations as a group of kind of laborers against, Uber as a company or the CEO of Uber. So that's one way you could imagine operationalizing a broader set of interests. Another way of operationalizing kind of a collective understanding of our interests in information is through imposing an enforced kind of limited monopoly right on large data companies. So saying, okay, Facebook, you've collected all of this valuable social data about people, rather than just saying it's yours forever and none of us can ever pierce the veil or subject that data to oversight and cleaning and eliminating the socially utilitous forms of that data. We say, okay, you can do that for 5 to 7 years. After that, you have to turn over control or sort of layer in an API that the management of that goes to, take your pick, some type of public institution. Maybe they grant that to a social scientific research institute of the University of California. And then that information is now managed as a public resource with a public mandate. Public state universities have a public education mandate and can be cleaned up. And all of the information that's mostly just privacy invasive and not of much social utility can get eliminated. And the remainder, if you're a researcher and you want to gain access to the social resource, you kind of go through a robust IRB process to gain access to that. And it's all sort of managed and controlled by information science and sort of librarian specialists in managing information in the public interest. So that's another way that we're sort of saying we have a public or collective interest in this information. It doesn't just get to be privately ordered and privately managed forever. But again, that would, as a first step, require us articulating in the law like a public claim that would require them to divest a resource or divert a resource into the public realm. And we do that with intangible assets all the time. I could go on and on about that example, but maybe I'll pause there.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And again, if folks have further questions about that, we'll have a robust Q&A shortly. So one other question I have for you is one area of the law that does do a good job of recognizing the consequences of people's membership in different populations and different groups is civil rights law. Yeah. And there's been a lot of talk about civil rights law, its potential and its limitations in this space. But, it is an area that can recognize how people suffer based on group membership through pattern and practice or disparate impact. So where does civil rights law for you fit in with what you've identified as a problem, a potential solution?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that certain forms of social relations of oppression that I'm interested in and that are being materialized in our data relations could potentially be addressed, at least partially, with a civil rights framework. So, one could imagine just the widespread partnering of Amazon Ring with like the Neighbors app that then just police use to surveil people. You could imagine people bringing civil rights actions against that kind of thing against Amazon and maybe being able to get somewhere with those kinds of claims. Where I think civil rights maybe don't completely encompass the kinds of data relations that I'm interested in is in some of the positive claims that I'd articulated. So I think that they might be really effective at the kinds of like, don't render me legible to a system of oppression, kind of like a negative claim or a negative right. But I don't think they're as effective at asserting an affirmative or a positive right. But like, in order for me to make a claim to a certain form of welfare or to make an entitlements claim, I'm actually making a demand to be legible to a system. I'm making kind of an affirmative legibility claim, like you have to represent me in this information infrastructure so that I can, get the direct payment deposit into my bank, or that you can make a timely welfare payment to me and that it arrives at the correct address. Like those are affirmative informational claims. I don't think that they, I wouldn't hold myself out to be an expert in civil rights law, but from what I can tell, they're not particularly good at articulating sort of demands to the positive conditions of freedom. They are quite good at articulating sort of the negative conditions of freedom.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. One thing that I've often observed is with regard, again, to the marginalized populations that I work with, is sometimes they have too little privacy, like Adam, but sometimes they have too much privacy. They're not legible, as you said, their credit invisible or their data invisible in ways that are really harmful because they're not connected with mainstream society and the supports that we can offer. And so it's like, how do we calibrate a healthy level of data privacy and data engagement where you're not left behind, but you're not, totally surveilled either. So that's such an important point.
Right. Yeah. And I think for me, that's why thinking of it in terms of data relations is so crystallizing, because if you just think about it as like, if you try to articulate our legal claims to information in the language of like, yes, no to legibility, you end up either saying, you either end up empowering people to make only a negative claim, like you can't render anyone legible for anything, or you end up degrading that, and so everyone can be legible for everything. By thinking about data relations, I think what's helpful for me about that is I can say, okay, rather than saying, am I legible or not, I can say, am I being placed in a data relation of exploitation, or am I being placed in a data relation of empowerment or equality? So like, if the information about me is being used to seamlessly deposit my $200, COVID pandemic relief amount into my bank account, that's a data relation of, empowerment. If it's being used to, pass me over in a racialized way for public housing, that would be a data relation of discrimination and racial violence even. So, we can now sort of, I think in a more fine-grained way, not say yes, no, but like, what is the quality of data relation that we're being placed into? And understanding like that as totally, and like understanding like that as the project, not like no data relations, all data relations, but like what kind of data relations do we want to be placed into? Like what is the digital means by which we want to relate to one another?
Right. Okay. So I feel like we should end here, and we're going to reconvene on the new Zoom link at 6:30. Does that sound good, Lauren?
No, I think that's not necessary. We can reconvene at about 6:25.
Okay, great.
Cool.
People also want to eat dinner and stuff like that, so I don't think they need a very long.
Got it. So we'll keep it moving. So I have that at 6:18, and we'll reconvene at 6:25.
That's exactly right. So please keep those questions ready. I know there's already one in the Q&A box. We're going to say goodbye for now. Once again, 6:25 is when we're going to reconvene, and Lucina has just put a link in the chat box if you're concerned that you don't have the Zoom link for the discussion. Thank you so much. I can't wait to get to the next event. All right, see you soon. Bye.
In a few minutes.
Yes.